And greetings, friends. Today I want to talk to you about an argument that's going around on the internet, and apparently there's a whole list of arguments on why we should not keep the Sabbath. The Bible.ca has a list of 80 arguments on why we don't have to keep the Sabbath any longer, and they say that these arguments Sabbath keepers can't answer. Well, we've took it upon ourselves to answer those arguments. You can find it on our website, at britishisrael.ca. And other websites have answered those arguments as well, including one Jewish website as well. But their first concrete argument against the Sabbath is this. It says, if every man from Adam to Moses kept the Sabbath, why is the Hebrew word for the weekly Sabbath found in the Ten Commandments never found in the book of Genesis? Now that's interesting. If they want to argue that way, well, the Hebrew word for Ratzak, which is found in the Ten Commandments, you shall not kill, or as it should read, you shall not murder, is not found in the book of Genesis. The Hebrew word for adultery, that's found in the seventh commandment, you shall not commit adultery. That word adultery is not found in the book of Genesis either. So does that mean that I can go around and commit adultery? I can go around and kill? Well, of course not. But when it comes to the Sabbath, well then when it comes to the Sabbath, well then yeah, we don't have to keep the Sabbath anymore. That argument fits only for the Sabbath, but not for the other commandments. As you find with a lot of these arguments against the Sabbath, you find these arguments when you start applying them to other commandments, well then they say, oh no. It's just the Sabbath. But James wrote that when you break one, you break them all. That they're all connected. Sin is sin. These commandments are not found, these words are not found in the book of Genesis. Why then does God punish Cain for killing Abel? Why did he bless Joseph for not committing adultery? And it calls it in Genesis 39:9 a sin. Why did he bless Joseph for not committing adultery? Why would God punish Cain, bless Joseph, unless there was a law in place? Remember, sin is the transgression of the law, and the wages of sin is death. And that's Romans 6:23, and 1 John 3:4. Romans 4:15 says, because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. So if there is no law, there's no transgression. Here we see laws in place, and God is punishing or blessing for either breaking or keeping those laws. How could he bless or punish unless those laws are in place? However, is the Hebrew word Sabbath found in the book of Genesis? Well, when you look at the word in Genesis 2, it says, and on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. That word rested is Shabbath. And you find it in Strong's 7673, and it means to make or to keep the Sabbath day. That's the word translated in Genesis 2:2. And it is used in the context of the Sabbath, resting in the verses of Exodus 16:30, which is before the Ten Commandments were given on Mount Sinai, and Exodus 31:16 and 17. In fact, in Exodus 16:30, the word is connected to God's commandments as seen in verse 28 before the giving of the Ten Commandments in Exodus 20. Now in the book of Genesis, why don't we see the commandment, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy? Was it known at that time? Well, it was known before the Ten Commandments were given at Sinai. You see that in Exodus 16th chapter. God mentions his Sabbath, and it was known. Was it known in the book of Genesis? Absolutely. The reason why we don't see remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy in the book of Genesis is because Genesis, the point of the book of Genesis, is that Genesis is a book of origins, not a book of law. So it is showing us the origins of the Sabbath. We see a lot of laws in the book of Genesis, like the eye for an eye law. We see where it originated from. And of course, it originated in the time of Noah, and so on. We see clean and unclean meats in the book of Genesis. We see the sin of adultery was known in the book of Genesis. So we see that the book of Genesis is not a book of law, it is a book of origins, and that the Old Testament 10 Commandments, the Old Testament laws, were known in the book of Genesis, but the point of Genesis is origin and not law. So, the concepts of these laws were known, including the seventh-day Sabbath. Now, to prove this point, we got to go to Jesus Christ of Nazareth. And notice what he says in Mark, the second chapter, 2 and verse 27. He says, "The Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath." Now, when was the Sabbath made? Well, way back here in Genesis, the second chapter. It says, "And on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he hath made. And God blessed the seventh day, sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God created and made." Here we see the first rest that took place on the Sabbath, and it was God's Sabbath. And then he took that Sabbath and he gave it to man. So God created that Sabbath day, and then he gave it to man. So the Sabbath was created in Genesis 2, and it was made for man. And in this context, the issue, in Mark 2:27, in this context, the issue here was over the seventh-day Sabbath, the fourth commandment. So the issue was the Sabbath that we find in the fourth commandment in Exodus 20. And Jesus went all the way back to creation. He said this Sabbath, the Sabbath was made for man. And when was it created? In Genesis 2nd chapter. So here Jesus is going all the way back to the beginning. And the word made that Jesus used took his listeners all the way back to the creation week. And the word man, well, who was created back in Genesis 2nd chapter, in the book of Genesis? Who was created? What man? Well, Adam and then Eve. And it was created for them. And, of course, their descendants. It was created for all mankind. In fact, the Greek word for man holds a more general plural meaning, and it really means all human individuals. You can look that up in Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. So here we see Jesus talking about the rest that took place in Genesis 2nd chapter, and he said that Sabbath, and when you look at Mark the 2nd chapter, the subject was the fourth commandment, the seventh-day Sabbath. And Christ went all the way back to the beginning, and he said the seventh-day Sabbath was created for all humankind, and God rested. So the Sabbath was created in the book of Genesis. It was known in the time of Genesis between Adam and Moses. Adam kept the Sabbath. Noah kept the Sabbath. Here in Noah, it says in 2 Peter 2:5, it says, "Spared not the old world, but saved Noah, the eighth person, a preacher of righteousness, bringing in the flood upon the world of the ungodly." Noah was a preacher of righteousness. Well, what's righteousness? Psalm 119, 172. "All thy commandments are righteousness." Noah preached righteousness or obedience to the 10 commandments of God. And so, not only did he preach it, he lived it. It says that Abraham, in Genesis 26 chapter, verse 4, or verse 5 rather, it says, "Because that Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." Those are God's laws. You can find this same expression in Exodus the 19th chapter, before he gave the law to Moses on the tablets of the 10 Commandments. It's the same. These are the same words, and it means God's laws, the 10 Commandments. The commandments were known in the book of Genesis. Why we don't remember the Sabbath day in the book of Genesis? Because that's not the focal point of the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis is a book of origin, not a book of law. So to say that this argument proves that we don't have to keep the Sabbath day anymore is just another Bible misconception.